Have you ever been in one of those meetings where the ideas are just flying everywhere? It's great, right? But then nobody really knows how to organize them or, what to do next. It feels like you're trying to grab a cloud. Well, today we are going to break down a really powerful method that's designed to solve exactly that problem. Okay, let's dive into something called concept mapping.
So here's our plan. We're going to map out the entire process, starting with that big cloud of messy ideas. Then we'll see how a group of people can actually give those ideas some structure, and we'll finish up by showing how it all comes together into one single, powerful visual strategy.
All right, so let's set the stage. Every organization, every team, every project really faces the same fundamental challenge at some point.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You've gathered all these opinions, all this feedback, a ton of qualitative data from everyone involved. And it's all valuable for sure, but it's just unstructured. How do you find the actual patterns in all that noise and decide what's really a priority?
This is exactly where concept mapping comes in. And look, this isn't just another brainstorming session. It's a really rigorous, structured process. The key words to remember here are participatory, because it involves the group every single step of the way, which helps build consensus, and visual map, because the end result isn't some long, boring report. It's a clear, intuitive picture of what the group is thinking, together.
All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts of how this actually works. The whole thing can be broken down into 6 distinct phases, and it all kicks off with gathering the raw material, the ideas themselves. You can think of this process as a journey in 2 parts. First, the participants, the people with the ideas, they generate, sort, and rate everything. Then, the researcher takes all that input, runs the analysis, and transforms it into that final visual map.
Now, the key to phase 1 is something called the focus prompt. This is so important. It's not just an open-ended, hey, what do you think? You give people a really clear starting point to make sure all the ideas are consistent and actually relevant. For example, the prompt might be a sentence they have to complete. Something like, to improve employee satisfaction, our company should...
So, throughout this whole explainer, we're going to follow a real-world example from a dissertation on doctoral advising. In this case, the researcher used that focus prompt to go through all the existing literature and pull out 40 specific statements about what helps students succeed. This list of 40 statements, that's now the foundation for the entire project.
Okay, let's move on to the next phase and see how this all builds. Once you have your list of statements, it's time to bring your participants back into the picture. But now, they're not just generating ideas, they're actually giving them some structure. Participants do 2 totally distinct things here. In phase 2, they sort. They're grouping all those statements by similarity, basically figuring out the relationships between them. Then, in phase 3, they switch gears, and they rate each statement one by one, giving it a value based on things like importance or maybe how difficult it is. Practically speaking, this is usually done online these days. A participant would see all 40 statements on their screen and just digitally drag and drop them into different piles. The researcher will often set a boundary like, hey, can you make between 2 and 10 groups? This just stops someone from putting everything in one giant pile or, making 40 separate ones.
So after all that sorting, participants then move on to rating. For our dissertation example, they were asked to rate each statement on 2 key things. First, how important is this for finishing a dissertation? And second, how difficult is it to actually implement? This dual criteria approach, well, that's what lets us create a real strategic action plan later on.
Now we get to the part where all that participant input, I'm talking all those individual piles and ratings, gets transformed into collective wisdom. The researcher takes over at this point, and honestly, this is where the magic really starts to happen. Using some specialized software or statistical tools, the researcher is basically hunting for patterns. The goal is to take hundreds of individual sorting decisions and boil them all down into one single picture that represents the group's shared understanding. It's pretty amazing.
So the analysis kicks off by creating what's called a point map. Every single statement becomes a dot on a graph. And here's the really cool part. Statements that people frequently sorted together are placed close to each other on the graph, while ideas that people thought were unrelated get placed far, far apart.
Now, once you have that point map, you can literally see these natural groupings of dots. By drawing boundaries around them, the map gets transformed into a cluster map, and this is what finally reveals the major themes that the group identified without anyone even having to say it.
Of course, these clusters need names, right? So the researcher, and sometimes they'll even work with the participants again, they'll look at the specific statements inside each cluster and give it a descriptive label. So if one cluster has a bunch of statements about meetings, respect, and communication, it might get the name advisor and advisee relationship. Make sense?
Okay, this is a really key transition. The cluster map is fantastic. It tells us what the main themes are, but it doesn't tell us where to start. To get our actual action plan, we need to bring back that rating data we collected on importance and difficulty.
And boom, here's the payoff. By plotting the average importance and difficulty ratings for each statement, or even each cluster, we get this awesome 4-quadrant grid. And that top left quadrant, that's the go zone. These are the ideas that are highly important but also relatively easy to implement. This is your starting line.
And that right there is the strategic heart of concept mapping. It doesn't just give you a list of good ideas. It gives you a data-driven, visual guide to prioritizing them effectively. You can build momentum by tackling those high-impact, low-difficulty actions first.
So, what happened in our dissertation example? Well, the process revealed these 6 core clusters as being critical for doctoral success. But the analysis didn't just identify them, it also showed which of those clusters were considered most important and least difficult, giving universities a super clear roadmap for how to improve their programs.
So, let's wrap this up. Concept mapping is just an incredibly versatile tool. It takes all that messy qualitative feedback and turns it into a clear, visual, and totally actionable strategy. And it really helps build buy-in, because the map is generated from the participants' own thinking, creating this shared sense of ownership over the final plan.
And that leaves us with one final thought. Whether it's for strategic planning at work, a community project you're involved in, or even just organizing a personal goal, think about where you're facing a cloud of complex ideas. What problem in your world could be made a whole lot clearer with a map like this one?